March 1939. Prague before dawn. A city suspended between breaths. A capital wrapped in an unnatural silence that felt heavier than the stone facades of its cathedrals and bridges. The sky was washed in a dull gray light, neither night nor morning, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over a world about to collapse. The Vltava River moved slowly, black and cold, reflecting the tremor of an unspoken fear that threaded through every narrow street and every shuttered window. Somewhere a church bell rang once, its echo swallowed by the fog that hung low above the cobblestones. It was the kind of silence that amplifies the smallest sound, where even the rustle of a newspaper carried the weight of a cannon blast. Prague had always been a city of music and industry and voices, but on this morning, March 15th, the silence felt like morning before the body had even grown cold. In that stillness, the streets lay almost entirely empty. Tram lines shimmered with damp frost, waiting for passengers who did not come. Shop doors remained locked though the owners were awake behind them, sitting in dark kitchens, clutching lukewarm cups of tea that went untouched. Radios hissed with low static where families sat crowded around them, waiting for news that no one wanted to hear spoken aloud. Mothers tightened scarves around their children's necks even though the children were not going anywhere. Men stood at windows with hands pressed against glass, watching the horizon as though expecting a storm to break. Every eye was directed toward the east, toward the border, toward the sound they could almost hear but could not yet name. No gunfire, no engines, just a growing pressure in the air, a vibration beneath the ground that suggested movement on a scale larger than anything the city had ever known. There were no speeches, no orders, no calls for resistance. Not yet, only waiting. And waiting is its own kind of torture. Along Narodova Street, near the foot of the Prague Castle complex, a few figures drifted like ghosts. Elderly men wrapped in heavy coats, a pair of workers still carrying their tools out of habit, a group of university students with tense faces and notebooks pressed against their chests as if they could shield themselves with paper. They walked slowly and spoke in whispers, not because they were afraid of being heard, but because speaking felt like betrayal of the silence that now defined the city. Even the pigeons in Old Town Square seemed to move with caution, lifting into the air in hesitant bursts as if guided by instinct more ancient than war. The statues of saints that adorned bridges and rooftops stared down with blank stone eyes, as immovable witnesses to the moment when history shifted beneath them. They had watched empires rise and fall. They had watched revolutions ignite, but they had never seen a nation surrender without lifting a sword. Across Europe, in the capitals where men in polished shoes and tailored coats debated lines on maps, the silence was different, polite, calculated, empty of conscience. In London, the morning newspapers were already being folded and stacked, prepared to speak with the voice of distance and diplomacy. In Paris, cafes began to open, chairs arranged on sidewalks slick with rain as men skimmed headlines but avoided eye contact, pretending everything was still under control. In Rome, the radio announcer spoke with rehearsed neutrality, avoiding the words that everyone understood but no one dared to say. And in Berlin, high-ranking officers dressed in immaculate uniforms studied charts and timetables, checking watches synchronized to the minute, speaking in clipped and confident tones. The inevitability of what was coming had long ceased to be a question. The only uncertainty that remained was how long the world would pretend not to see what was unfolding in front of them. The German armored columns that crossed into Czechoslovakia did not thunder like an invading horde. They moved with the cold precision of a machine that had already won before the first engine started. Tanks and trucks rolled over the frontier under orders that expected no gunfire, no confrontation, no resistance. Soldiers sat upright, their expressions impassive, told that their arrival would be peaceful, administrative, even welcomed. They were not entering enemy territory. They were entering a country abandoned by its allies, disarmed by agreements signed far away. Behind the rumbling engines and the grinding treads was the unspoken knowledge that this invasion required no war. The war had already been lost in conference rooms months earlier, traded away for the illusion of peace by men who congratulated themselves on avoiding conflict while turning their backs to those they had sworn to protect. Steel moved forward. Hope moved backward. No flags waved. No crowds cheered. Only the low growl of engines spreading across the countryside like a slow-motion collapse. The Czech army remained in its barracks under orders not to engage. Soldiers who had trained for years to defend their homeland now stood in silence. Clutching rifles they were forbidden to lift. Many stared at the floors or out the windows, faces hardened by humiliation that burned deeper than fear. They were men ready to fight, men who had stacked ammunition crates with their own hands, who had memorized defensive strategies and studied every inch of the Sudetenland terrain, men who had kissed their wives goodbye believing duty meant sacrifice. Now their commanders walked through the rows of bunk beds, delivering a message that struck harder than any weapon. Stand down. Do not resist. There will be no battle. Some soldiers wept openly. Others tore insignias from their uniforms. A few vomited into trash bins or onto their boots. Silence can crush a man more violently than shrapnel. In the factories of Skoda Works and the industrial towns of Moravia, workers arrived at dawn to find guards posted at the gates, unfamiliar uniforms replacing the ones they knew. The machinery that had once represented Czechoslovakia's strength and independence now felt like a cage. They understood, without being told, that everything they built from this day on would no longer belong to them. The hum of turbines and the clank of steel pressing machines sounded different now, like weapons being assembled for the wrong hands. Those workers did not shout or strike or protest. They stood with their caps in their hands and stared at the ground. Their silence was not acceptance. It was grief. As German troops approached Prague, the fog began to thin, revealing the outlines of tanks crawling along the roads that led to the capital. They came not at full speed, but at a steady pace calculated to create inevitability. Countless boots struck the asphalt in perfect rhythm, the sound like a slow heartbeat echoing between buildings. By mid-morning, the first armored vehicles rolled over the bridges crossing the Vltava. The city did not erupt in chaos. People emerged from doorways and gathered along sidewalks, motionless, watching as the occupation unfolded like a funeral procession. Women clutched rosaries. Men removed their hats. Some bowed their heads. Others stared directly at the soldiers, faces carved with bitterness so sharp it could cut steel. A few children tried to wave, confused, but their mothers pulled their hands down and held them close. From the balcony of a government building overlooking Wenceslas Square, a thin line of officials watched with the posture of men awaiting their own sentencing. They did not speak. They did not gesture. They simply watched as the world they governed slipped from their fingers without a single shot fired. The helplessness in their eyes mirrored the helplessness spreading through the crowd. The smartly dressed diplomats from European embassies stood at a distance, observing the scene with rigid expressions carefully crafted to reveal nothing. They represented nations that had promised protection, had assured that Hitler's appetite would end with the Sudetenland, that the Munich Agreement meant safety and peace. Now they watched the consequences of their signatures in silence, unable or unwilling to intervene. They knew what was happening, but they also knew they would return to comfortable rooms and write neutral reports filled with vague language and passive verbs. They would describe the occupation not as an act of aggression, but as a transition, a reorganization, a shift in administration. Words designed to conceal truth rather than confront it. The sky over Prague darkened though the hour was still early, clouds gathering into a heavy mass that seemed to press down on the city. The air smelled of cold water and diesel fuel. The first columns of German soldiers entered Wenceslas Square, their boots splashing through puddles left by a night of rain. They marched in straight lines, faces forward, rifles slung but not raised. They did not shout commands or pound drums. They simply moved forward, step after step, claiming the space by occupying it. The crowd parted around them like water around rock. Not a single voice called out. There was no chanting, no jeering, no applause, only breathing, only stillness, only silence. For a long moment, time appeared to stop. The soldiers paused in formation, the long barrels of their vehicles pointing down the boulevard like arrows aimed at the future. The people of Prague stood motionless. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and immediately stopped. A train whistle sounded faintly and faded into the wet air. A man in the crowd adjusted his glasses and wiped his face with a handkerchief, though no tears were visible. An elderly woman lifted her chin and stared directly into the eyes of a German officer as he passed. Neither looked away. The confrontation lasted only a second, but it contained an entire century of anger and betrayal. As midday approached, the fog dissipated, revealing the full scale of the occupation. More vehicles rolled into the city, their engines humming with cold confidence. Soldiers climbed onto rooftops and secured government buildings. The Czech flag was lowered slowly from the castle and replaced with the red, white and black standard bearing the swastika. The fabric unfurled in the wind with a heavy snap that echoed across the city like a gunshot. Some gasped, others turned away. A few stared without blinking, as if by witnessing they could prevent erasure. But nothing stopped. Across Europe, Radios finally spoke the words that had been hanging in the air for months. They announced the occupation with clinical detachment, framing it as a strategic action, a correction, a stabilization. The headlines printed hours later referred to it as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a phrase crafted to sound gentle, almost benevolent, a phrase designed to hide violence beneath vocabulary. Newspaper vendors called out the headlines, but no one reached for them. People walked past stands without slowing. The world already knew. They had known long before the first tank crossed the border. They just pretended they didn't. As the afternoon light dimmed, a cold wind swept through the streets of Prague. The tanks stopped moving. The boots stopped marching. The engines quieted. All that remained was the oppressive silence that had begun the day. It settled over the city like dust, coating every surface, filling every breath. The people did not scream or run or fight. They stood still and watched, their hearts pounding against ribs that felt too small to contain the pressure of the moment. They understood what had happened even before anyone said the words out loud. Czechoslovakia was gone, not conquered, not defeated, simply abandoned. And in that silence, Europe changed. The illusion of peace that had been clung to so desperately shattered like glass. Those who believed they could negotiate with ambition discovered that ambition needs no permission. The myth that surrender could prevent war dissolved in the shadow of tanks parked beneath castle walls. The belief that silence was safety proved fatal. The world had not been saved. It had only delayed its reckoning. That day did not explode. It suffocated. It did not roar. It whispered. It did not spill blood in the streets of Prague. It drained hope from them. And that, in the end, was more devastating than fire. That was the day Europe surrendered without speaking, and history shifted forever. The months leading to March 1939 unfolded with a tension that spread across Europe like a slow, invisible poison. It did not arrive suddenly the way cannon fire does, or the way explosions tear through silence. It crept quietly through speeches, treaties, handshakes, and smiles that concealed terror behind diplomatic etiquette. The world watched a storm build in slow motion, clouds gathering at a distance, while men who should have held umbrellas chose, instead, to admire the sky. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 stood at the center of that storm, a document celebrated in London and Paris as the salvation of peace, presented to the public as proof that reason could tame ambition and that ink on paper could restrain a dictator who had built his power on defiance. Crowds cheered beneath fluttering flags. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines, and politicians congratulated themselves on averting another catastrophe like the Great War. Few noticed that the ink had barely dried before the consequences began to unfold. What they called peace was not peace at all. It was the quiet before the flood. The Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia's fortified border region, to Germany. On maps, it appeared as a thin strip of land curving around the edge of the nation, but its importance was not measured in miles. Inside that strip lay the fortifications, artillery, defensive bunkers, and strategic high ground that the Czechs had spent years constructing to protect their independence. The Sudetenland was the shield guarding the heart of the country. By giving it away, the Western democracies did not simply adjust borders. They removed the armor protecting a young nation whose military strength could have resisted invasion. The fortifications were abandoned without a bullet fired. Engineers who had built them watched in sickening silence as German troops occupied them within days. Nothing had changed visibly. No cities burned. No soldiers fell. But the country was already dead. It just had not yet fallen to the ground. Neville Chamberlain returned to London carrying the document signed in Munich, waving it triumphantly like a trophy. He spoke of peace for our time, believing that diplomacy had triumphed over war. Crowds chanted his name. Factory workers paused from their labor to listen to his words broadcast through radio speakers hung on walls stained black from coal dust. Families gathered around kitchen tables and breathed relief, believing their sons would not be sacrificed to mud and trenches like the generation before them. Peace felt like safety. Safety felt like hope. But hope based on illusions is the most fragile substance in history. It fractures under the slightest pressure. It crumbles when tested. It dissolves the moment truth arrives. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler observed the reactions with calculated precision. He had always understood that power was not merely military strength. It was psychological dominance. He knew that fear could break nations more effectively than artillery. He knew that every concession encouraged the next. He knew that when the defenders of peace choose caution over courage, aggression becomes unstoppable. His speeches grew bolder. His demands grew larger. His strategies broadened from conquest to humiliation. He did not simply want territory. He wanted to demonstrate that he could seize it without fighting. He wanted to prove that the world would not oppose him. He wanted to show that treaties could be torn as easily as paper, that international promises meant nothing without the will to enforce them. Munich confirmed everything he believed. Czechoslovakia possessed one of Europe's strongest industrial bases. Its arms factories produced tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, and ammunition of exceptional quality. Its engineers were among the best in the world. Its army, even without complete mobilization, could have inflicted heavy casualties on any invader. Its fortifications in the Sudetenland were among the most advanced defensive systems in Europe, integrating natural terrain with reinforced concrete bunkers and carefully designed artillery positions. If Czechoslovakia had been supported by its allies, if France and Britain had promised armed intervention, if the League of Nations had acted decisively, if the Munich Agreement had never been signed, the German military, still rebuilding and not yet fully prepared, would have faced a brutal struggle. War might have been prevented precisely by demonstrating readiness for it. But instead, the world chose compromise. They chose to sacrifice one nation in the hope of saving themselves. They chose to believe words rather than confront reality. And by doing so, they made war inevitable. When the Czechoslovak government was ordered to accept the Munich terms, the betrayal cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Officers burned documents rather than surrender them. Families packed their belongings and fled territories handed to Germany. Students marched in protest, carrying banners demanding dignity and resistance. Workers gathered outside factories, chanting for mobilization. They did not want peace at any price. They wanted respect. They wanted sovereignty. They wanted the chance to fight for their homeland. But the decision had already been made far away, in rooms where maps mattered more than human lives. Orders came down. Stand down. Do not resist. Accept the agreement. Those words crushed something inside the nation that would never fully recover. As the Sudetenland was occupied, German troops filmed their entrance, presenting it to the world as liberation, not conquest. Propaganda cameras captured images of selected crowds cheering, waving flags, offering bouquets to soldiers. These images were broadcast as proof that the occupation was peaceful and desired. But outside those orchestrated scenes lay silence, grief, anger, and fear. Entire villages emptied overnight. Families were split by borders that did not exist a week earlier. Thousands of Czech and Jewish residents fled, abandoning homes, land, and lives built over generations. Everything changed without a single artillery round fired. That was the most dangerous lesson Hitler learned. Victory without war was not only possible, it was easy. Inside German military command, officers studied reports detailing Czechoslovakia's strategic value. They understood that by seizing its industry, they could supply their army for wars not yet declared. They calculated that by annexing the Sudetenland, they had secured natural barriers and fortifications for their own use. They recognized that by crushing the morale of a proud and capable nation without a fight, they had sent a message to every country watching. Resistance was futile. They saw the Munich Agreement not as a diplomatic victory, but as proof that the Western democracies lacked will. And when a dictator learns that the world will not stop him, he does not slow down. He accelerates. After Munich, the Czech government collapsed under pressure. President Edvard Beneš resigned and fled the country. A puppet administration was installed. National identity dissolved step by step, layer by layer, while the world looked away. The promise of protection from allies had turned into abandonment. The people who once believed they were part of a global community now realized they stood alone. That realization became the silent prelude to March 1939. By the time German troops marched into Prague, the battle had already been lost. Not militarily, morally. In diplomatic circles across Europe, men whispered behind closed doors. They argued strategy in soft voices. They worried about appearing weak, yet they acted weak. They debated possibilities they would never pursue. They feared provoking war, and in doing so guaranteed it. Fear disguised itself as caution. Caution disguised itself as wisdom. Wisdom collapsed into paralysis. When nations choose comfort over responsibility, tyranny thrives. The betrayal of Czechoslovakia marked the moment when appeasement transformed from strategy into surrender. The Western statesmen who believed they had preserved peace realized too late that they had simply postponed conflict at the expense of those they sacrificed. The illusion shattered quickly. Newspapers that once printed celebrations began printing doubts. Military analysts raised alarms. Intelligence reports described a rapidly expanding German arsenal now strengthened by Czech factories working under new command. Yet the governments continued to speak the language of hope rather than the language of truth. They clung to the belief that Hitler could still be reasoned with, that he would stop after taking what he claimed was his last demand. They did not understand that the appetite of conquest grows with every meal. The Czech people carried the weight of betrayal more heavily than any army could. Teachers tried to reassure their students that patriotism still mattered. Priests urged their congregations to remain calm and pray. Veterans who had fought in the Great War sat in pubs, staring silently at glasses they did not drink from. University professors lectured to half-empty rooms. Writers and journalists smuggled manuscripts through underground networks, trying to preserve fragments of identity that now felt endangered. Every morning, citizens woke to the reality that another piece of their sovereignty had disappeared overnight. The process did not require violence. It required silence. And silence was everywhere. It echoed through the chambers of the League of Nations. It weighed heavily in the halls of the French Assembly. It reverberated across the polished floors of British diplomatic offices. It hovered over newspaper editorials, searching for language that would not offend. It sat like fog over Prague, dense, suffocating, unavoidable. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. Silence is participation. When Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the world reacted with shock. Though nothing unexpected had occurred, the signs had been clear, the intentions announced, the ambitions visible. Yet shock became the performance through which leaders attempted to absolve themselves. They spoke of violation, aggression, and betrayal, but their outrage came too late to matter. They condemned what they themselves had enabled. Their speeches were not written for Prague. They were written for history. The photographs taken during those days show faces frozen in expressions that say everything words failed to say. A woman clutching a small suitcase, lips pressed tightly together, eyes wide with fear and defiance. A group of young men standing at attention with empty hands where a rifle should have been. A priest raising his hand in blessing as soldiers marched past, his expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. A child perched on his father's shoulders, staring silently at tanks rolling across a bridge. A Czech officer removing his cap and pressing it against his chest as foreign flags replaced his own above the castle. No heroic battles were fought on that day. No victories were won. No medals were earned. But something more profound than military defeat occurred: the collapse of belief. A nation that trusted its allies realized that trust had been misplaced. A people who prepared to defend themselves were ordered to stand aside. A world that had sworn never again after the Great War learned how quickly promises dissolve under pressure. The fall of Czechoslovakia was not simply a territorial acquisition. It was the breaking of Europe's moral spine. Once broken, it could not be repaired. The consequence of Munich was not temporary humiliation. It was the irreversible shift of global momentum toward darkness. And when Prague fell into silence, the lesson became unmistakable. Sometimes nations die not because enemies are strong, but because friends choose not to stand beside them. The world had watched Czechoslovakia walk toward the edge with open eyes. And when it fell, the world did nothing. The cost of that silence had only begun to reveal itself. Morning arrived in Prague on March 15, 1939, not with the warmth of sunrise, but with the gray heaviness of a sky that felt carved from stone. Dawn did not break. It leaked slowly into the world, like light filtering through ice. The streets were still. The air was sharp and cold, filled with the faint metallic scent that precedes snowfall, though no snow would fall that day. Windows were shuttered. Market stalls stood abandoned, canvas covers pulled tight and trembling in the wind. Church bells did not ring. Trams rested motionless along tracks polished smooth by years of commerce that now felt like a memory. There were no crowds, no conversations, no laughter, no commerce. Only a silence so complete that the faint hum of distant engines sounded like thunder. It was the morning when a nation held its breath, knowing that whatever happened next would reshape everything. Long before the sun reached the rooftops, the first German units crossed the Czech border. Motorcycle brigades moving in tight formation carved straight lines through the frosted countryside. Armored scout cars followed, then columns of infantry trucks, and finally the heavy, rhythmic grinding of tank tracks crushing frozen earth beneath steel. The invasion guns remained silent. No artillery fired, no shots echoed. It was conquest without battle, occupation without resistance, dominance without sound. The roads leading into the capital, once filled with farmers' carts and trains of goods moving to factories and railways, had become arteries delivering foreign power directly into the heart of a defenseless state. In garrisons across the country, Czech officers received orders in short, clipped statements: do not engage, do not fire, do not resist, stand down, maintain order, avoid bloodshed. It was the final blow to morale already exhausted by betrayal. Soldiers stood in formation waiting for orders that never granted them dignity. Their rifles remained locked. Their artillery sat cold and unused. Their uniforms still carried insignias representing a nation that, by decree of others, no longer possessed the right to defend itself. Some officers stared at their hands as if seeing them for the first time, realizing they would not be allowed to use them. Some refused to remove their sidearms, even though they were forbidden to draw them. Some ripped the patches from their sleeves and threw them onto the floor in wordless grief. And some, understanding the weight of the moment, wept silently in the privacy of storage rooms, barracks, and stairwells where no one could see. Civilians emerged slowly from their apartments, pulled by a mixture of terror and disbelief. Doors opened cautiously. Faces appeared in windows, pale and tense. People stood in stairwells unable to move, listening to the distant growl of engines reverberating off the stone walls of the old city. Fathers wrapped coats around children. Grandmothers held rosaries with trembling fingers. Shopkeepers leaned into doorframes, gripping wood polished smooth by years of daily work now rendered meaningless. Students exchanged glances on street corners, eyes filled with questions none could answer. The people of Prague had seen photographs of refugees fleeing the Sudetenland months earlier. They had read newspapers describing Munich as the protector of peace. They had been told that compromise had saved Europe. But the sound on the horizon said something different. The sound said that compromise was collapse. When the first German vehicles appeared on the edge of the city, they did not charge forward with cinematic drama. They advanced with mechanical precision, disciplined, methodical, inevitable. Motorcycle messengers took the lead, engines echoing between the narrow walls of the ancient streets. Panzer columns followed at controlled speed, steel armor glistening under the washed-out morning sky. Rows of infantry trucks rolled behind them, soldiers sitting motionless, hands resting on rifles they did not need to fire. Their expressions revealed nothing, neither triumph nor remorse, only the blank efficiency of an army executing orders. It was not a parade. It was a demonstration, a message carved in steel. Resistance was impossible. Opposition was unthinkable. The outcome had already been decided. Crowds formed gradually, drawn to the streets by the gravity of the moment. Men stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking. Mothers clutched children tightly against their legs. Shopkeepers closed shutters and locked doors though nothing remained to protect. Groups of students pressed together in silence, their faces rigid, eyes unblinking, witnessing history not as participants, but as captives. There were no chants, no banners, no riots, no cheers, only the collective tension of an entire city absorbing humiliation like a physical impact. People did not blink. They did not breathe. They watched. German soldiers stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with the citizens whose country they had come to take. The room between invader and witness, those few feet of silent distance, felt heavier than any battlefield smoke. The silence grew denser with each rumbling engine. Boots struck the cobblestones with the rhythmic weight of a heartbeat slowed to a dangerous calm. The city felt like a body lying paralyzed beneath a surgeon's blade, aware of every movement, yet powerless to resist. In the great squares of Prague, crowds reached the tens of thousands. The statue of Saint Wenceslas loomed above Wenceslas Square like a stone guardian watching a world collapse beneath him. Birds, startled by the noise, burst into flight and vanished against the gray sky. Soldiers dismounted from trucks and established checkpoints. Machine guns were positioned not for combat, but for control. The soldiers' faces were neither cruel nor triumphant. They were indifferent. Indifference cuts deeper than hatred. Hatred acknowledges the opponent. Indifference erases him. Czech police, still wearing their own uniforms, were commanded to assist in keeping order. Their presence a bitter reminder that the country's institutions continued to function only as tools for its occupiers. People approached them with desperate expressions, whispering questions. What will happen? Will there be arrests? Will there be conscription? Will there be violence? But the police could only shake their heads. They had no answers. They no longer held authority. Their uniforms had become costumes. The orders to the Czech army clarified that any resistance would be punished with mass executions. Generals who had spent their lives preparing to defend their homeland now sat behind desks, powerless. Military trucks were parked in depots, keys removed. Ammunition stores were locked and sealed under German oversight. Airfields that once launched modern fighters stood silent. Aircraft lined in rows like museum exhibits. The Czech pilots who had trained for years looked skyward at the low clouds and wondered whether they would ever fly again. In barracks and offices, maps depicting defensive strategies were rolled up and thrown into storage cabinets like relics of a future that would never come. At 9:06 a.m., German tanks reached Prague Castle. The soldiers dismounted, boots striking stone steps worn smooth by centuries of kings, saints, scholars, and presidents. The national flag above the castle was lowered slowly, its descent witnessed by thousands standing below. The silence deepened into something unbearable. A new flag rose in its place, black, white, and red fabric climbing the pole, visible to all who stood in the square. It was a moment that required no sound. The symbolism cut deeper than any speech. A country once proud, modern, educated, industrial, democratic, had been erased without a battle. Radio stations across Europe interrupted programming to broadcast the news. Commentators spoke with voices strained by disbelief, repeating words that felt unreal. German forces have entered Prague. Czechoslovakia has been dissolved. The occupation is complete. World order has changed. In London, Paris, and Moscow, diplomats sent urgent telegrams requesting clarification. Governments issued statements expressing concern and regret. Newspapers rushed to prepare headlines. Yet nowhere did a government declare action. Nowhere did a leader announce intervention. Nowhere did a nation mobilize troops or promise support. The microphones of the world vibrated with the hollow echo of condemnation without consequence. The world watched and did nothing. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler prepared for his entrance into Prague. The route had been carefully selected, the timing carefully arranged. Adolf Hitler did not rush. His power grew not from sudden strikes, but from calculated steps. When he finally entered the city shortly after midday, he did so in a motorcade flanked by officers in immaculate uniforms, vehicles polished to mirror brightness. The sound of engines roared through the narrow streets like a storm. Crowds pressed back against buildings, forming walls of silent witnesses. Snow began to fall lightly, thin and uneven, flakes dissolving as they touched the warm steel of the vehicles. Hitler stood in an open car, glancing upward at the architecture towering above him. Romanesque stone, Baroque ornament, Gothic spires. He entered the city not as a conqueror by force, but as a ruler by absence of resistance. His presence was the final punctuation mark after months of hesitation and silence. Hitler's car passed through Wenceslas Square. The enormous crowd watched with expressions that fused fear, hatred, confusion, and stunned paralysis. Nobody waved. Nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. There were no flowers thrown at the wheels of the car. The silence was louder than any chant. It was the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a nation realizing, in a single instant, that it had not been defeated by the invader, but by those who chose not to stand beside it. European newspapers published photographs within hours. The images traveled across borders, faster than armies ever could. Photographs of German tanks rolling past the National Museum. Photographs of soldiers marching across the Charles Bridge. Photographs of citizens with hands covering their mouths. Photographs of Hitler standing at the gates of the castle once symbolizing independence. The world saw these images and understood their meaning. Appeasement had failed. Diplomacy had failed. Promises had failed. The illusion of peace had shattered. War no longer lurked as possibility. It had become inevitable. Inside universities, students gathered in lecture halls where classes no longer mattered. Professors stood at podiums unable to speak. Books lay open on desks untouched. History felt as if it were being rewritten before their eyes, erasing everything they had been taught. Outside schools, workers stood beside factory gates, staring at the buildings that would soon produce weapons for the occupier. They understood that the steel they had once forged for their own defense would now be used against others. A nation built on industry had been transformed into a machine for its enemy. In churches, priests lit candles and prayed while congregations knelt on wooden floors polished by generations of knees. The prayers were not for victory. They were for meaning, for dignity, for strength to endure what could not be changed. Bells remained silent that day. No choral voices filled the vaulted ceilings. Faith bowed not to conquest, but to helplessness. On bridges and rooftops, young men watched German troops erecting checkpoints, stringing communication wires, positioning spotlights and barricades. They watched armored cars settle into intersections like iron roots gripping stone. They watched machine gun nests constructed at the entrances to government buildings. Their faces hardened into expressions that were neither fear nor surrender, but the quiet sharpening of memory. The occupier controls land, but not the mind, and memory is the seed of future resistance. In diplomatic offices across Europe, telephones rang endlessly. Meetings were called hurriedly. Papers shuffled. Ministers paced rooms lit by desk lamps burning late into the night. They drafted statements expressing concern. They calculated political risk. They weighed options. And then they chose the easiest one: delay. Delay became caution. Caution became abstention. Abstention became silence. The world watched and chose not to act. For the people standing in the streets of Prague that morning, time seemed to slow until every second felt like an hour. Tanks rolled over stones that had carried generations. Boots struck ground that had known centuries of freedom and struggle. Armored columns wound through the city like veins of steel. Banners bearing the swastika unfurled across buildings, once decorated with national symbols. The occupation transformed the familiar into the foreign. It transformed home into prison. There are moments in history when the world shifts not through war, but through the absence of war. When silence becomes more devastating than battle. When surrender occurs not through defeat, but through abandonment. Prague on March 15, 1939, was such a moment. And when the last echo of engines faded into the distance, one truth lingered over the city like smoke left behind after a fire that never needed flame. The world watched and chose not to act. In the days that followed the occupation of Czechoslovakia, the world moved forward with a surreal normalcy that concealed a rupture no less violent than the explosive beginning of war. Newspapers printed editorials expressing shock and dismay, but their pages were framed by advertisements for spring fashion and theater performances, as if everyday life could continue untouched by the tremor that had shaken the foundations of Europe. Diplomats issued statements threaded with cautious language, designed to sound firm while promising nothing. Politicians spoke of negotiations, stability, and peace. Words drained of meaning by the reality already cemented on the cobblestones of Prague streets. It was the quiet after the impact, the deceptive calm that follows an injury before the pain begins. The world had witnessed the dismantling of a country built not by conquest or monarchy, but by democratic aspiration, industrial achievement, and cultural vitality. And yet the world turned away. Czechoslovakia, once a modern industrial state respected for its efficiency, innovation, and strategic location, was transformed overnight into a resource base for the Reich. Factories that had produced locomotives, automobiles, aircraft engines, and precision tools were seized. Their operations redirected to feed the German war machine. The Skoda Works, one of the most sophisticated industrial complexes in Europe, shifted from civilian production to manufacturing artillery, armored vehicles, and ammunition. Workers now labored under supervision, their efforts transforming steel into weapons that would later tear across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Rail networks that once transported goods across a prosperous nation now carried raw materials, labor drafts, and military supplies. Schools adopted curriculums stripped of national identity. Public buildings displayed portraits of German leaders. Newspapers printed propaganda. Freedom dissolved not with gunfire, but with signatures, uniforms, and the systematic re-engineering of daily life. The psychological transformation was even more profound. The occupation revealed a truth that would reverberate throughout the continent. Peace purchased through compromise is not peace, but delay. Citizens who had believed that diplomacy could prevent conflict now walked through streets, patrolled by soldiers, speaking a foreign language. Intellectuals who had celebrated rational governance now found themselves publishing cautiously or not at all. Journalists learned their pens were no longer instruments of truth, but tools of compliance. Students understood that their future had been confiscated, and families discovered that courage without allies is indistinguishable from sacrifice. No gunfire echoed across Prague. No bombs fell, and yet the weight of conquest pressed more heavily than artillery ever could, crushing hope, confidence, and identity beneath its machinery. Across Europe, the occupation of Czechoslovakia rippled outward like a shockwave. In Paris, London, and Warsaw, leaders recognized what they had refused to admit. Hitler did not seek compromise, negotiation, or limited territorial correction. He sought domination. He sought empire. He sought the dismantling not only of nations, but of the idea that nations could resist. Munich had been proclaimed a victory for peace, a triumph of diplomacy, a moment when war had been avoided through reason. Now it was revealed as the greatest miscalculation of the decade. The policy of appeasement, built on the belief that concessions would satisfy ambition, instead demonstrated that ambition feeds on submission. It was not failure. It was catastrophe. The consequences were immediate. The fall of Czechoslovakia eliminated a crucial strategic buffer between Germany and the East. With Czech defenses neutralized and its industry absorbed, the right gained direct access to borders that would soon become launching points for invasion. With Czech armaments rolling off assembly lines under German command, Hitler's military capabilities expanded dramatically. Tanks built and seized factories later spearheaded the assault on Poland, crushing resistance with industrial power forged in silence. Aircraft manufactured using Czech machinery carried destruction across Europe. The men who operated these machines marched confidently because they had seen what silence could accomplish, the conquest of a nation without firing a shot. The occupation shattered illusions that had persisted since the end of the First World War. It revealed that treaties and organizations designed to preserve stability lacked the power to confront aggression. The League of Nations, conceived to guarantee peace, proved unable to enforce even its most basic principles. France and Britain, once pillars of European security, demonstrated paralysis masked as caution. The idea that conflict could be avoided through goodwill evaporated, replaced by the grim acknowledgement that war was not merely likely, it was inevitable. The only question remaining was when it would begin, and how many would die before it ended. Inside Czechoslovakia, resistance began quietly. It grew not from political doctrine or military organization, but from memory of independence, dignity, and cultural identity. Teachers preserved banned books in hidden libraries. Workers sabotaged production lines. Students distributed clandestine leaflets. Priests delivered sermons coded with messages of defiance. Families sheltered fugitives. Farmers withheld grain. Every act carried risk. Every act carried meaning. Resistance did not roar. It murmured, whispered, smoldered. It lived in the space between fear and duty. The occupiers controlled territory, but not the spirit of those who refused to forget who they were. The cost of silence reverberated far beyond Prague. In Warsaw, mothers watched the news and held their children tighter. In Paris, veterans of the Great War stared out windows, knowing they would be called again. In London, young men lined up outside recruitment offices not in triumph, but in resignation. The understanding spread like a cold wind across the continent. Peace had already died, and Europe was simply choosing when to acknowledge its death. The occupation of Czechoslovakia was not the beginning of war. It was the moment when the world recognized that war had already begun. When German forces marched into Poland 6 months later, it was not with uncertainty or hesitation. It was with the confidence born from Prague. It was with the certainty that democracies would hesitate, negotiate, deliberate, and calculate while armies advanced. The fall of Czechoslovakia demonstrated that fear could defeat courage long before armies met on the battlefield. It proved that silence is not neutrality, but surrender, and it revealed a truth that history repeats with relentless consistency. Evil does not require overwhelming strength to prevail. It requires only the absence of resistance. Years later, survivors would speak of the occupation not as a moment of defeat, but as a moment of revelation. It exposed the fragility of freedom. It shattered the architecture of complacency. It revealed the cost of believing that principles can be defended without action. It demonstrated that democracy must be protected not only at the borders, but within the conscience of those who uphold it. And it showed that the collapse of nations begins long before the arrival of tanks. It begins with hesitation, uncertainty, and silence. The streets of Prague eventually changed. New faces filled the squares. New uniforms marched past the statues. The city rebuilt itself, layer by layer, like sediment accumulating after a flood. But beneath the surface, the memory remained. It lived in photographs showing crowds standing motionless as German troops advanced. It lived in documents recording decisions made in faraway capitals. It lived in the quiet spaces between lines of official statements. It lived in the silence of those who had been present and could still feel the weight of that silence decades later. And it lived in the question that history continues to ask again and again to every generation that believes itself safe from consequence. What does it cost to remain silent? The day Hitler took Czechoslovakia, Europe learned the answer. It was the day when diplomacy dissolved into illusion, when courage dissolved into calculation, when the idea of peace dissolved into the reality of domination. It was the day when a nation stood unarmed before a storm and discovered that abandonment can be sharper than gunfire. It was the day when the world surrendered without speaking. Evil did not win because it was strong. It won because nobody stood against it. And when the streets finally emptied, when engines faded into the distance, when the sky darkened over the spires of Prague, and the first night of occupation settled like a shroud, one last truth lingered in the silence left behind. When the world chose silence, the future chose war.